A 4-year-old boy vanished without a trace, and America believed it found him. But the truth will shock you, because the child returned to the Dunbars may not have been their son at all. Nearly a century later, DNA exposed a devastating secret. The happy ending was a lie. On August 23, 1912, the Dunbar family arrived at Swayze Lake in Louisiana for what was meant to be an ordinary summer outing. 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar spent the morning running along the edge of the water, throwing sticks, laughing, and exploring the thick cypress roots that curled from the swamp. No one imagined that within hours, his name would be printed in newspapers across the country. At some point in the early afternoon, while his parents were tending to lunch preparations, Bobby slipped out of sight. It wasn't unusual. He was an energetic child, curious and fearless. But when minutes stretched and the boy still didn't return, the tone shifted. His mother, Leslie, called out repeatedly. There was no answer. His father, Percy, began searching the shoreline. Still nothing. Panic spread quickly. The lake was surrounded by dense swamp, murky waters, and deep pockets of mud. Locals knew the dangers well. Alligators lurking below the surface, sudden drop-offs, and miles of tangled vegetation capable of swallowing a small child whole. As the first searchers arrived, many feared the same terrible conclusion, that Bobby had wandered into the water and drowned. That evening, dozens of volunteers arrived with lanterns, combing the shoreline in knee-deep mud. Some waded waist-deep into the lake, feeling blindly along the bottom with wooden poles. It was a desperate, chaotic effort. At one point, searchers set off small charges of dynamite in the water, a grim technique that, in those days, was believed to make a drowned body rise to the surface. Nothing appeared. Over the next day, the search expanded dramatically. Hundreds of men arrived from nearby towns, farmers, fishermen, railroad workers, all determined to find the missing boy. They dragged the lake, scoured the swamp, crawled through thickets, and hacked through brush thick enough to swallow their boots. Soon, stories began to circulate. Someone claimed to have seen a barefoot child wandering north of the lake. Another insisted Bobby had been spotted near the railroad tracks. A third reported hearing a child crying deep in the woods. Each rumor sent men running in a new direction, only to end in disappointment. And then came the most ominous discovery. A small footprint, barely recognizable, pressed into the mud near a patch of swamp grass. Searchers found strands of hair caught on a branch nearby. To many, these signs seemed to confirm their worst fear, that Bobby had struggled in the swamp before disappearing beneath the water. But something didn't fit. Despite the lake being searched over and over, despite the use of dynamite and dozens of boats dragging the bottom, no body surfaced. The Dunbars clung to that fact with rising desperation. If Bobby had drowned, surely he would have been found. The absence of a body left room for a more disturbing possibility: kidnapping. With no answers and the story gaining attention, newspapers from New Orleans to Dallas printed the boy's photograph. The Dunbars offered a substantial reward. Soon, letters and telegrams poured in. Sightings of blonde boys in Texas, Alabama, Mississippi. Most were easily dismissed. But the longer Bobby remained missing, the more the public fixated on the case. Meanwhile, the Dunbars remained at the lake for days, refusing to leave the place where their son vanished. Leslie collapsed repeatedly from exhaustion. Percy grew increasingly silent, staring across the water as if expecting his son to emerge from the fog at any moment. Weeks passed with no progress. Then came a break. A report from Columbia, Mississippi. A man traveling with a young boy was attracting suspicion. The child was about Bobby's age. The man claimed the boy was his nephew. Some locals believed him. Others were certain he was lying. The Dunbars, desperate for any lead, traveled to Mississippi. What happened next would spark one of the most controversial identification scenes in American history. It would pit science against emotion, truth against hope, and set in motion a tragedy that would unfold over nearly a century. For now, one fact consumed the nation. A 4-year-old child had vanished in broad daylight, and the truth, whatever it was, lay buried in the swamp. The lead from Columbia, Mississippi changed everything. After weeks of dead ends, the Dunbars traveled there with a mixture of hope and dread. Locals had gathered around a traveling handyman named William Walters, a man who wandered the region repairing pianos, tuning instruments, and doing odd jobs. With him was a young boy who resembled Bobby, though thinner, quieter, and visibly frightened. To the townspeople, Walter's story sounded suspicious. He insisted the boy's name was Charles Bruce Anderson, the illegitimate child of a woman named Julia Anderson, who had allowed him to take the child temporarily. Walters claimed he had helped raise Bruce from infancy, and that they were simply traveling together. But the lack of formal documentation, combined with a frantic national manhunt for a missing child, made his explanation easy to doubt. When the Dunbars arrived, the scene turned chaotic. Dozens pressed around them as the sheriffs escorted the boy into the room. This was the moment America would later mythologize. A charged reunion. A miracle. Yet those who were present reported a very different story. When Leslie Dunbar first saw the boy, she froze. Her hands trembled. She studied his face for a long, painful moment, then whispered, "I don't know." The child did not reach for her. He didn't call her Mama. He did not even seem to recognize her. The crowd waited breathlessly. This was not the emotional reunion they imagined. That night, Leslie returned to the hotel shaken. She cried, prayed, and told Percy she wasn't sure. The pressure on the Dunbars, emotional, societal, psychological, was enormous. Their son had been missing for over 8 weeks. The newspapers were watching. The entire nation wanted a resolution. The next morning, Leslie returned for another meeting with the boy. This time she declared he was Bobby. What changed overnight has been debated for more than a century. Some believe maternal instinct finally kicked in. Others think the mother, racked with grief, convinced herself out of desperation. And some historians argue that she was influenced by a powerful mixture of hope and public expectation. Either way, the decision was made, and it would alter countless lives. Walters protested immediately. He insisted the boy was Bruce, not Bobby, and begged authorities to speak with Julia Anderson. But few cared to listen. To the public, a villain made more sense than an ambiguous truth. Walters was arrested and charged with kidnapping. The child, now officially Bobby Dunbar, was taken to Louisiana. The return was treated like a holiday. A parade greeted him. Neighbors cheered as Leslie lifted him from the train. Reporters described the reunion in poetic, exaggerated tones. Illustrations showed a joyful boy leaping into his mother's arms. Scenes that never actually happened. But behind the celebration, there were disturbing inconsistencies. The boy could not recall the Dunbars' home. He did not recognize his bedroom. He did not know the family dog, something the real Bobby adored. He seemed confused, withdrawn, even intimidated by his new parents. Still, the Dunbars clung to him fiercely. They had lost their son once. They would not risk losing him again. And the public, craving closure, accepted the story without question. Then, Julia Anderson arrived in Louisiana. Poor, exhausted, and humiliated, she stood before the court to claim the boy as her own. She insisted she had given Walters permission to take Bruce for what she thought would be a few days. She testified that she had other children but had struggled to care for them financially. Julia was a woman alone, unmarried, impoverished, and facing townspeople hostile to a mother outside society's moral boundaries. When she was presented with the boy, she hesitated. He had grown, changed, lost weight. She asked to see him without the Dunbars present, but her request was denied. The boy, exhausted and overwhelmed by the ordeal, did not immediately run to her. The press crucified her. Editorials painted her as irresponsible, immoral, and unfit. Her hesitation in identifying the boy was portrayed as proof of guilt. In this atmosphere, she never stood a chance. The court ruled in favor of the Dunbars. Walters was convicted of kidnapping, sent to prison, and branded a villain in national headlines. Julia returned home defeated, her reputation destroyed, and her son, whoever he truly was, lost to her forever. Meanwhile, the boy grew into his new identity. Photographs from the following years show a child smiling, playing, living as Bobby Dunbar. Outwardly, the story seemed complete. A family reunited, a mystery solved, a nation satisfied. But beneath the surface was a lingering unease. Neighbors occasionally whispered that the boy didn't resemble the Dunbars. Some relatives insisted privately that he looked nothing like the missing Bobby. And on rare occasions, in moments of frustration, the child reportedly shouted a different name: Bruce. The story, celebrated as a miracle, was beginning to crack. Only decades later would it finally shatter. When the truth was uncovered, it would reveal not just a mistaken identity, but a century-long tragedy born from fear, grief, and the desperate need to believe in a happy ending. For nearly a century, the story of Bobby Dunbar was treated as a miracle, a tale of a lost child found and a family restored. It lived in newspapers, history books, and family lore as proof that even in tragedy, fate could be kind. But beneath the comforting narrative was a quiet tension that followed the Dunbars for generations. There were whispers within the family, private doubts, and questions no one dared ask aloud. Why didn't the boy recognize his parents? Why had he called himself by another name? Why did Julia Anderson's grief feel so painfully real? By the late 1990s, one person finally decided to confront the truth. Her name was Margaret Dunbar Cutright, Bobby's granddaughter. She had grown up hearing the legendary family story, how her grandfather had been rescued from a kidnapper and restored to the people who loved him. But as an adult, she noticed how inconsistent the tale was. Family members contradicted each other. Old newspaper clippings didn't match the accounts passed down through generations. The deeper she dug, the more the story unraveled. Margaret began a private investigation, combing through archives, court transcripts, and long-forgotten letters. She traveled to libraries across Louisiana and Mississippi, searching for anything that could reconcile the contradictions. What she found only made the mystery darker. Newspaper articles from 1912 and 1913 portrayed Julia Anderson not as a reckless mother, but as a victim of poverty and prejudice. Eyewitness testimony revealed that several people in Mississippi had recognized the boy with Walters as Bruce, not Bobby. And some reporters had even questioned the Dunbars' identification at the time. But those voices were drowned out by public pressure for a happy ending. Even more troubling were the prison documents from the trial of William Walters. They showed that Walters had consistently maintained his innocence. He wrote letter after letter proclaiming that the boy was Julia Anderson's son, and that he had been trusted with the child since birth. "I have been wrongly condemned," he wrote in one. "The truth will outlive us all." Margaret began to wonder if the real tragedy wasn't simply Bobby's disappearance, but what society had chosen to believe. Her research stretched over years, and then, in 2004, she proposed something extraordinary: a DNA test. Bobby had grown up, married, and had children. His son, Bobby Dunbar Jr., agreed to provide a sample. So did the descendants of Alonzo Dunbar, Bobby's younger brother. If the two lines were biologically related, the test would confirm the century-old story. The results were undeniable and devastating. The DNA did not match. The child who had lived, grown, and died as Bobby Dunbar was not a Dunbar at all. The news shattered one of America's oldest true crime narratives. The joyful reunion celebrated in 1913 had been a tragic mistake. A stolen identity, a child taken from the wrong family. The revelation reopened old wounds long thought healed. Margaret described feeling both heartbreak and clarity. "I loved my grandfather," she said, "but the truth matters. And someone else lost a child too. Someone history forgot." Historians revisited the case with renewed urgency. They concluded that the boy returned to the Dunbars had almost certainly been Bruce Anderson, the son of Julia Anderson. The woman dismissed, mocked, and stripped of her rights because she was poor and unmarried. While the Dunbars gained a son, Julia lost hers forever. She died years later, still insisting the boy had been hers, still ignored by the world. As for the real Bobby Dunbar, the mystery only deepened. Some believed he drowned in Swayze Lake, his body lost to the swamp. Others speculated he had been taken by someone who never came forward. A few held out hope that he had survived under another name, living unknowingly far from home. But the truth remains lost. No body was ever found. No evidence ever surfaced. The child who vanished in 1912 remains missing more than a century later. The DNA revelation did more than rewrite a story. It exposed a tragic legacy. It showed how grief, public pressure, and blind hope can twist justice. How a community desperate for a resolution can embrace a comforting lie, and how a child can be erased not only from a family, but from history itself. In the end, the case of Bobby Dunbar stands not as a miracle, but as a warning. A reminder that truth is not defined by belief. That evidence will eventually rise, even after 100 years. And that the greatest tragedies are often born not from violence, but from the lies we tell ourselves to escape it.